So what we're going to talk about tonight is the differences between the Access desktop and the web apps. And again, this is going to be mainly just discussion. I don't have a lot of things to show you necessarily, but kind of want to get you thinking, I guess. So the question is always going to be which one to use. Are we using the desktop, or are we going to be using a web app? Obviously, since we're talking web apps here for this users group, then that's kind of where we're going to key on. But when the process first starts with a client or whatever project you're working on, you need to be able to decide what's the best thing. You know, we're not just doing this because I happen to like web apps. We're doing this because we're trying to solve a problem for a client in most instances, or a problem for ourselves. So what we want to do is we want to look at kind of the pros and cons. And sometimes what seems to be a pro for one client could be a con for another client. And we'll kind of talk about a couple of those issues here as I go along. But again, it's just something that you've got to weigh out. So if we look at the pros of the desktop, the first thing that comes to my mind, because I consider myself a programmer, is it's extremely versatile because of the fact that we have Visual Basic for Applications running behind it. We've got all the coding tools at our fingertips. There's so much you can do. I mean, like I say, I've been working with Access for, 15, 16 years now, and there's plenty of things that I'm still, run across and say, oh, I didn't even know that was available to me. So there's a whole lot that you can do with VBA. You've got strong reporting. Very simple to set up a report and, make a very nice looking report for whatever data you've got in that desktop app. It's right there. It's built in. It's easy to use. Again, it's a strong reporting function. Your data can be stored locally. If you've got a single computer that you're running this app on, this desktop app, that data can be right there. Most of the time, developers split between a front end, which is your program, and the back end, which is where the data is at. But it can be stored right there. It could be stored on a server on site. Or if you've got other data sources, you can connect to them with your ODBC connections. So really, you're very, you've got almost limitless ways of connecting with your data from different places. The desktop is a very mature product, and they're going to be supporting it through at least, I didn't spell that right, did I? At least 2023. And to me, that's a little bit scary. We say, well, it's at least 2023, but we all know that things change. So it may be that they're going to move completely to a different type of product. Maybe web apps is going to continue to be expanded, and nothing is going to happen with the desktop version. I don't really know for sure, but that's the word, at least 2023. So some of your cons for the desktop, and I understand that there's people in the IT world that are in big corporations or whatever that just don't like Access, period. But usually those are reasons for, or the reasons are because of the way they run things within their company. But one of the things is it's kind of hard to share with off-site users. So if you've got something that needs to be, data that needs to be accessed from a remote location, sure, there's ways you can do that, but it makes it more difficult. It makes it more difficult to upgrade and modify and support when those people aren't on site. Each user needs either their own copy of Access or Access runtime. So again, you're having to make sure something is installed that's going to run your program. And then, of course, you've got versions of different versions of Access will run backwards compatible, but they, if you've got a newer version of the database, like if you're programming in Access 2013 desktop and the person only has 2007, chances are they may run into some problems. They're trying to run that program. I've got down easy to deviate in the consistency of the system, meaning the look and the feel and just kind of how things flow. And that's multiplied if there's multiple people that are developing the system. I've run into things before where, and I even do it myself, I find myself looking at something and think, well, why did I do it that way here, and I did it somehow a different way in another place. And when you've got multiple people, that's really easy to get into that type of pattern. So looking at web apps, the pros for web apps, the first thing is it's all done in a SQL database. For the database, the web app itself is stored there, but your backend where your data is also part of that SQL database. So that's something that everybody likes because it's secure, it's powerful, it's a lot less limiting as far as size, number of, or amount of data, that type of thing. And like I mentioned, the SQL database is created for your data, but also your web app is stored there. So all your forms are saved as views, your queries your queries are saved as views. Actually, I believe your forms are too. Your macros are saved as stored procedures, I believe. So it's all in that one SQL database. And as you saw with that quick little example that I gave you, it's got a consistent look and functionality. And it's a professional look. It's kind of the new Microsoft look. And because they have all those controls built in where, how do I edit a record? Well, it's always that little pencil. How do I save the record? It's always the little diskette. How do I delete a record? It's always the X button. So that's going to remain consistent no matter what you do with your Access web app. That's very, very nice feature. Now, here's one of those things that could be a pro for some and a con for others. There's no code. It's all macro-driven, so it's easier for users and power users to create and edit. You don't have to worry about knowing syntax necessarily. You get into some of the functions, there are certain ways you have to do it, but those are things that are easily learned. You don't have to be a programmer. So that's a very powerful feature for a lot of folks. If they're just a user or even a power user and they've got a simple project, that's something that they can do very easily themselves and come out with a very, very nice looking product at the end. And probably the best part is that it's available to anyone through a web browser. It's easy to share. So if I gave you the link to that test app that I set up at the very beginning, you could all right now be entering assets and employees and categories just like I did. It's very, very easy. Anybody with a web browser can access it. And as you saw, I used a template. There's a bunch of templates available. Maybe they're going to fit perfectly with what you want, maybe not, but maybe it's a good starting point so that you don't have to create the entire thing. That's always, anything that saves time is a good thing. That's always a good thing. If Microsoft makes changes and they're it's immediately available to you is what I'm trying to say. Got a little tongue-tied there for a second. And again, this is another thing that I'll talk about in a minute that's a pro here, can also be a con. But something like I was kind of looking through today some of the changes that they've made since I was mainly working with this the last couple of years. And one of the things that they added, I think a couple of months ago, was that you could download in Excel. So if you're looking at a data sheet and you want to take that data and do some manipulation or whatever in Excel, they made it very easy to download that and do that. So that was something that you didn't have to upgrade, you didn't have to update, it just showed up. So that's a nice benefit also. So now we look at the cons. And here, again, this is one of the examples that could be a pro or a con. you've got limited macro action function set. There's no VBA, no programming per se. So the macro actions are things like looking up a record, editing a record. You can raise an error, stop a macro, etc. And then functions are things like if you're casting from a number to text, or if you're using the date diff or math functions. Those are all functions. They're much more limited here than they are in the desktop version. But again, that's okay because it makes it easy for people maybe that aren't as familiar with programming to be able to do that. If you want to get a list of the macro actions and the function set, you can just Google Access Web Apps SQL and Expressions Reference. That'll take you to an MSDN site or page that will give you access to all those, so you can take a look. I think I counted through. I did a talk a year ago on the functions, and I think at that time there were like 53, between the math functions and the date functions and the string functions and whatnot. And then I don't remember what the number of macros themselves are. Another kind of a big con for a lot of people is that there's no built-in reporting. So you can't, produce a form or a report online and then say, oh, I want to print that easily. So what you've got to do if you do want to do that is you set up a desktop version of your database, or you set up a desktop app and connect that to your web app and be able to do your reporting there. Since the database is a SQL database, you can use any sort of reporting service that will work with a SQL database. So that's actually kind of nice there, but it's nothing that's built in. It does require an Office 365 account or an on-premise SharePoint installation that's running Access services. So if you've got Access 2013 but no Office 365 account, or your company doesn't have a SharePoint installation, then basically you are just like you were before. You can do desktop apps, but nothing as far as a web app, because there has to be a place for that web app to live. And in this case, like I say, it's the Office 365 account, or the larger companies might have an installation of SharePoint. And then we come right back to the changes that Microsoft makes. They may affect something that you've already done. An example is of something that Andy and I ran into on the Waterfall Calc system. And maybe I should back up a little bit. I guess I probably should have talked about this at the beginning of who I am. Been programming. Andy and I kind of crossed paths, and we had kind of gotten to know each other a little bit. And in 2013, early 2013, he called me and said, hey, have you got a little bit of extra time that you could help me on a project? I'm getting behind. I've got several things going. And he had this project, and he's talked about it, I'm sure, on a regular basis, but I'll just kind of recap if we've got anybody new. Project whereby it was going to work with loans that were needing to be modified. So it's an FHA program through the government, and there's a slew of calculations that get run when somebody says, hey, I'm having problems paying the mortgage, I've missed some payments, what can I do? And this is, everybody's heard of the HARP program. They hear it advertised on TV around here a lot. This is actually HAMP. I think it stands for Home Affordable Modification Program. So this, Andy had a client, and she had put together a really great Excel spreadsheet that she was doing these HAMP reports for people, different loan servicers. And she thought it would be just great to put this thing online and let them enter their own information to get the reports out. So this was what he was working on. He was quite a ways down the road already, needed some help. So that's where I really learned how to do Access web apps. And it was kind of trial by fire because, he said, here's what it is, let's go. So I kind of learned as I went along. And it was great because, I had a real world example to be working on. It was quite complicated. In several different areas of the project, and we made it work, so that was great. But getting back to this Microsoft making changes, they, at some point or another, and this happened to us maybe 2 or 3 different times where there were changes that affected something that we had already done and it was working. So I don't want to scare you, but it does happen. But one particular example that I can remember is the client complained. She said, well, this number needs to be formatted differently. And so I looked at it and I thought, that's funny. All the numbers on that form were formatted the same, and they were formatted as currency. I don't understand. So I started to dig in, and I looked at the form, and the view. I should call it a view because that's what we call it in Access Web Apps. But it's a form. I looked at the formatting for that field, and it was set to currency. But yet, when we looked at it on the screen, when the app was running live, it wasn't. And I thought, well, that's really strange. So in the end, after trying to figure out why this wasn't working, I went back to the original table, and that one field, for whatever reason, when the table had been set up, that field hadn't been set up as a currency field. Now, I'm used to the form taking precedence over the table, and that's the way it had worked originally. But somewhere, something got changed, and all of a sudden, the table took precedence over the form. So that's an example of something that got changed, and all of a sudden our app didn't break, but it sure looked different in a couple spots. So just, again, that could be either a pro or a con, because the changes show up immediately. That's great. You don't have to do anything. But also, if they change something drastically, you may have a problem that you have to fix. So now, how do we approach these projects? Because we've got, if we're Access people, we've got 2 different ways we can go. We're going to either go with a desktop version of our project, or we're going to go with a web app. And as we look at this list that I'm going to talk about, just because one answer is obvious doesn't mean it's going to override all the other considerations. So we might ask a question, and, oh, well, definitely, it's got to be a web app. Well, if we look at all the other questions that we've got to answer, maybe a web app doesn't work. So that's the kind of thought process that you have to go into or put into this. So first, I'm always thinking, well, who's going to use this thing? All right, who are the end users of what we're doing? In my case, I'm always working for a client, and it seems like it's always somebody different, and everybody's got their own situation. So are the users all in-house? So just, they're right there. They're all connected with a network that's in-house. Maybe they've got a server, and we can just connect. We'll put one back end on the server. Everybody has their own front end, and away we go. Or do we have maybe some telecommuters or some remote users? So then it's a little more difficult. We could use a remote type of connection where they would log into their computer at work and run the app. That would work. That would be the same as if they were sitting there. Or maybe we've got a salesman that's out on the road, and he wants to just be able to say, I don't care where I'm at, but I'll have a web browser. I might not be able to remote in, but I could get to a web browser. So those are, some initial considerations. Where should the data live? Okay, it's kind of a progression here. So where should the data live? Should it live locally on a server? Should it live in a SQL database that's in the cloud, that's online? These are the first questions you need to be asking before you really get into the details of what the project is. And this next one goes right along with that one, is the client even comfortable with online storage? So is it feasible to have the data stored online? Your client is going to push you one way or the other on this, I would say. And it doesn't really matter whether they're right or wrong. Some people just don't trust putting their data out online, especially when you hear just about every other day in the news where somebody got hacked, and it is a concern. Now, certainly with using SharePoint, Office 365, the way things are verified, the credentials and all that, I feel pretty good about what we've got as far as web apps. But some people aren't. I've got a client, and this is this is a mom and pop type of place. It's a small company, single location. They've got a program that I wrote, a desktop program, and they've got it running basically on one computer, and they won't even let that computer be allowed to be connected to the internet. So that's pretty extreme. So that computer basically gets no updates or anything. The only time anything is connected, I did write them an ACH module where they could upload their automatic payments from their customers to the bank. That's the only time that gets connected to anything. So that's an extreme, but it is something that you might have to deal with, something you might have to take into account when you're setting or when you're deciding how to do a project. I can remember years ago when I first got started as a programmer, we were selling an accounting software. And this is, again, back in the 80s, mid-80s, and we ran into a company that was quite a large company that had all of their data, I'm not kidding you, in the center of a large room in a big bank of filing cabinets on cards. Handwritten cards. And that was their accounting system. And they were very distrustful of putting anything on a computer. And again, that's a dated story, but it's the same today. We're kind of in the same place. Now everybody's used to computers, but they're not so used to the online storage of their data. So it doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. It's just what you've got to deal with. What type of output needs to be generated? So that goes back to the fact that we've got great reporting with the desktop, and we don't have any built-in reporting with the web app. So that's another thing that you've got to think of right out of the box. The next thing is, are there complicated business rules that we need to be, that they're going to take advanced code, so we need to take that into account. Again, since we have a limited macro and function set in Access Web Apps, there's some things that I don't want to say can't be done, but they're very hard to do. I'm not sure who might have been sitting in. I did a talk last year on some replacement functions that I built for this waterfall calc system. Things that our client, she had written in Excel and just used a, so okay, I'm trying to think of one of the examples. I think it was a DLOOKUP. And that was just something you punch in DLOOKUP and a couple of coordinates, and that was very easy to do in Excel, and there was no way to do it easily in Access Web Apps. But I was able to build a workaround, and you can do that for a lot of things, but you've got to decide, well, is it going to take me more time to do those types of things than it would to figure out a different way to make a desktop work? The more complicated the system, the more you have to do your homework ahead of time, and the more planning it's going to take before you actually make a decision. So, and this is the point where if they've got some really complicated things, that's where you've got to sit down probably and really detail out, how does that get calculated? How is that going to be done we know we can do it in VBA, but can we do it with macros? I'm the type of programmer where, if they say something needs to be done, I'm going to sit down with a pencil and a piece of paper and kind of map it out and say, okay, this and this and this, and then I sit down and start coding. But when you're looking at having a limited set of macros and functions to work with, before you start off down that road, you want to make sure that you can, get to the end. So it takes a lot more planning. And then I think last month, I believe Andy talked about connecting a desktop to, and using just a regular, using your regular VBA type program or system, and connecting it to the Access Web App data. So you're storing your data online, but you're not really using that as such. You're still doing it in-house or locally as far as the process itself, the calculating and all that whatnot. And then again, also, you could also have that running, but then add some of the online web app stuff, maybe just some forms for entry or whatever. So that kind of creates a hybrid system. And maybe that's best in some instances also. So what projects are best suited to access web apps? If you go through what we just talked about, you're going to be in a better place to decide for yourself, basically. I'm not going to say this one's better or that one's better, because I think that really takes away from your creative thought process and the unique situations that each project presents. The best thing I think that web apps have going for them is that it's their relative ease of getting a working system up and running. Like I showed you at the beginning with that quick example, and again, that was a template, but had I sat down and just duplicated that template myself, maybe you could have that thing running in an hour if you did your planning ahead of time. Okay, if you had if you had your tables, you knew what your data was, you knew how you wanted to do it. It wouldn't take that long to create that thing from scratch. Excuse me. But I wouldn't rule out any project until going through what we just did a minute ago, looking at those different types of things. And there's so many more things. Those are just kind of the high points of what I think need to be looked at before you decide, is it going to be a desktop or can I do it with a web app? I think experience is always the best teacher. The best way, I think, to learn anything is to find yourself a small real-world project that you can build, and in this case, you can build it as a web app. Once you've done it, you'll be able to much more easily determine what kinds of projects will work and which ones won't. Again, it's not like I've worked with a ton of web app projects, but the one that I did work with Andy, it encompassed just about everything. We ran into so many different situations that we thought, oh, this can't be done. But we did figure out a way to make them work. And I guess that's why we had the knowledge that we did when we got done. We did end up creating a hybrid system because we needed reporting. So we made a desktop version, or not a version, but a desktop app that connected to our data, and its sole purpose was to just monitor when somebody wanted a report, and it would produce the report and email it to them. So we got into that. We got into those functions that we had to duplicate that weren't available, like I talked about a minute ago. All those things, once you get into them, that helps you to know better for the next time. So basically, that's what I had for tonight. I think that if we want to, if anybody's got a question, go ahead and ask it, and I'll do my best to answer. I'm sure there's other folks on the group here tonight that do have maybe more experience than I do, that somebody should be able to help you out with an answer. But I do appreciate your patience with me, and hopefully I give you a little bit of information and something more to think about, and will help as you go down this road. And you can either unmute yourself and ask the question, or if you want to just type it into the chat, I can reread it, or I guess we can all read it, but we can go from there. I usually like to ask everybody where they're from. I see Charles is from Sacramento, and that's the only one I guess that I can see where you're from. And again, for those of you that might have tuned in late, Andy was on his way back from Portland, the users group weekend that they had. And so he was, I'm not sure if he's actually on the ground somewhere or if he's home or what, but he just wasn't going to be able to make it tonight, so he asked me to sit in. and happy to do that to get to hopefully share a little bit of information and maybe get to know some of you a little bit better. I was just looking back through. I guess I didn't see the post that Charles made while I was talking there about others can only share if they have a Microsoft account. Yes, this is true. And what we did for the waterfall was we set up accounts for them. Again, this was a commercial enterprise, so that was something that they got charged for. Now, I have not worked with it, but I know somebody had figured out a way that you could get one account and distribute that to many people, and I think it was up to 500 that you could have on one account. So there is a way to do this where you could share also the account. But again, it depends on the situation, I think, because what we're doing is we are limiting what we're doing to people only being able to see their records. So if you have one account, I think probably what this person did was he had the one account but then had a separate login within the system, I think. But I think Andy knows all about that. So Jack's from Portland, Paul's from Reno. Can you access your SQL data in the cloud using other front-end apps? Anything that can connect to a SQL database can connect to that data. There should be no problem with that. It keeps jumping on me. I'm trying to read. My screen keeps jumping. I'm going to jump down to the question about the missing users can enter data but not modify the website. You can lock the website. First of all, you can distribute the link so anybody with the link can get to it. But then initially, the way they had it was that there was that little gear icon up in the upper right where it said back to the site, I think, and then you could go back and basically get to where that web app was stored. I think the way they've changed it now is that you can lock the app so nobody can edit it except the developer. And I see Judy said that you can give them permission level of your choice, so that's done with through SharePoint. Steve, with the deploying and upgrading, I think they've done a little bit of work on that. The one thing that I didn't like initially, and I suspect it's still pretty much the same, but they've kind of changed things a little bit with the on deployment macro, data macro. But yes, the problem initially was that you have one site, one app. So if you need to change something, you're working on that app, which is never a good idea. But that was the way it was. So basically what I found myself doing was working, at night when no one was on the app. But then if you messed something up and didn't catch it, then, we all know how that works. Access 2016, any idea? Honestly, I have not looked into what's new. I know that they're not going to be adding any just as far as I understand it, I don't think they're going to be doing any just desktop editions anymore. So, they may have them in there, but I think the main thrust is going to be with the web apps and that type of thing that they're going to be doing. And thanks, Judy, for answering those questions as I'm not getting to them. And again, I am not the end-all of all things web apps, so it's great to have knowledgeable people that are part of the group. I think that's the power of doing these types of things, is that we can all share the information, and it kind of helps reduce the frustration level for because we've all been there. I know we have, or maybe I'm the only one. I don't know. Those times when you know something's possible and you just can't figure out how to do it. That's Jack. That's exactly what I was thinking. Was that if they're going to keep releasing it, then they will keep supporting it. So that is great, because a lot of us, that's mainly what we're working with. So, and again, I foresee, at least in my mind, I foresee a need for that type of thing, even if everything is going online. I still think there's going to be things. Okay, Steve says and I see he sent it privately. Yeah, because we're Yeah, Charles said send it to everyone, then we can all see them. And I was talking about Jack's comment that they did release Access 2016 for desktop, so that means it's going to extend the time that it'll be supported. And then Steve noted that just for our information, Andrew Couch's new book has an excellent section on upgrading and deploying web apps. So that would be a good read then for all of us, I would think.